The long-awaited turning point has arrived, carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths, and it is sweeping away every shadow that once tried to hold you down. Those who built their strategies on your downfall are now forced to watch as their illusions collapse, unable to fathom how you navigated storms meant to break you and emerged with a presence that shifts the very air around you. The attempts to dim your light have only deepened its brilliance, transforming you into a force that bends the story in your favor. While your focus was on building, healing, and creating, unseen movements were dismantling the very foundations of those who underestimated you, and now they're left searching for the ground beneath their feet. Some stories are never truly lived on the surface. They breathe in the spaces between intentions, and this one has been unfolding behind a curtain you never asked to step behind. Hidden within the quiet corridors of fate, there was a presence that moved long before your arrival, aligning events with precision only a patient architect could manage. It wasn't random kindness or spur-of-the-moment generosity. It was a deliberate current guiding every encounter toward an inevitable reveal. There existed a mind so skilled in silent influence that it could tilt another's entire sense of direction without ever raising its voice. This was not someone who simply crossed your path. They had been weaving threads in your absence, mapping out scenarios meant to erase you before you even realized you'd become part of the design. You are here for a reason. If you feel the call, answer it. Click Join to unlock exclusive content, deep insights, and a powerful community. This isn't just a membership, it's an awakening. Step into your divine purpose. Join the chosen. Every offering you extended, be it compassion, clarity, or a word that carried weight, wasn't simply absorbed into the air and forgotten. It was imprinted into an unseen record, a kind of spiritual archive documenting the lengths true care will go when tested by schemes it never deserved to face. What you gave was more than emotion. It was a mirror. A reflection of unshaken strength meeting a framework built to fracture anything pure. You showed what is possible when love refuses to fracture under suspicion. You became the living proof of what stands unbroken when the ground beneath it was laid to crumble. But you didn't only extend your hand, you offered the map. You spotted the illusions tightening around them and urged them to see. You pointed toward paths that would lead out of danger, tracing the outlines of patterns that would otherwise stay hidden. You tried to place freedom in their palm, but they clutched the familiar chains instead. Your presence was a measure against which falsehood could no longer hide. When you gave without expecting return, it made every transactionally motivated gesture around them glow with its true intention. When you offered insight with no strings, it stripped the varnish from advice laced with quiet control. Your care acted like a lantern in a room full of counterfeit lights. Once the real flame was visible, every imitation dimmed in comparison. They didn't understand that your authenticity wasn't there to flatter them. It was there to reveal the hollowness of the stage they were standing on. Then came the shift. The soft hum beneath events grew louder, and the edges of the picture sharpened. What you learned next was not a single plot against you, but an interlaced web, a network built in the shadows, with roots twisting through relationships you thought were untouched. It wasn't the work of one hand, but many, each moving with its own selfish rhythm. A maternal figure who bound loyalty with invisible threads, acquaintances whose smiles masked alliances with your opposition, and others who cloaked their harm beneath the guise of guidance. If your heart overflows with God's blessings, let that love shine. Click the super thank you button and give $40 or more to plant seeds of faith that will impact countless lives. Your generosity reflects His abundance. Be a vessel of His grace and watch His kingdom flourish through you. Some forces weren't merely human in their intent. They operated in ways that felt as if they were drawn from something colder, older, and willing to sink low to block what they could not control. Their efforts were not just to hinder, they were to ensure you never stepped into the version of yourself they feared most. Yet in trying to dismantle you, they left their own blueprint exposed. The more they gathered to slow you down, the clearer their shapes became in the light you carried. What they didn't account for was that your journey had been watched by something far greater, and that every obstacle they set became evidence in a story they could never rewrite. And so, The hidden hands that thought they moved in silence now find themselves standing in the open, facing the very energy they underestimated. An energy that no longer needs to chase truth, because truth has been walking beside it all along. Some forms of opposition aren't random. They're engineered with the precision of someone who fears what you might awaken in another. There was a figure who had been reading the contours of your presence long before the two of you crossed paths. They recognized that if a true bond ever formed, the foundation of their influence would dissolve. So they set out to dismantle that possibility before it could breathe, creating a web of tactics meant to wipe you from thought, not just from sight. This was no clumsy interference. It was a calculated orchestration meant to keep your existence muted in their world. Every attempt they made to distort the perception of you became its own contradiction, carving your authenticity more sharply in contrast. Every effort to block your influence left a deeper, unshakable impression that they could neither erase nor fully explain away. Their reach extended beyond whispered rumors or small manipulations. It drew in individuals who claimed expertise in disrupting unions touched by higher purpose. These self-proclaimed specialists sold illusions of guaranteed separation, parading stories of their supposed successes. But what they didn't anticipate was colliding with someone whose spirit was guarded in ways they couldn't decode. The person you poured into was being fed two entirely different streams. Yours, which was rich with growth, and theirs, which carried a slow poison hidden inside what looked like care. While you encouraged clarity, they pressed fog into every corner of their vision. While you nurtured independence, they quietly built dependence on their approval. They didn't strike at obvious weaknesses. They twisted strengths. Trust became a tether. Loyalty became a leash. The natural desire to maintain harmony was reshaped into compliance. They made the choice between you and them appear as the choice between love and betrayal, knowing that such framing would keep them anchored in guilt. But no strategy, no matter how meticulously crafted, can outrun the balance built into the fabric of existence. What they unleashed began its slow turn, gathering force far beyond what their limited understanding could anticipate. The return was never going to be gentle. It would come like the breaking of a dam. Signs of that shift began to surface quietly. Restless nights turned into vivid encounters they could not explain away. Scenes that reminded them of the connection they had denied. These weren't idle dreams. They carried the weight of recognition and the sting of loss. Even the most familiar tactics began to falter. The guilt-laden conversations no longer landed with the same certainty. The emotional hooks that once held without question started to loosen. A subtle resistance began to grow where there had once been only submission. The shift wasn't loud at first, but it was unstoppable. Something deep within them began to awaken, like a tide rising against the will of the shore. The more they tried to ignore it, the more it pressed forward, whispering truths that no outside hand could silence. The figure who had worked so tirelessly to maintain control could feel the current turning against them. What had once been effortless manipulation now demanded constant effort, and even then, cracks continued to appear. Each moment you remained aligned with your truth pulled another thread loose from their grasp. Every silent victory you won on your own path sent a signal that reached further than any barrier they built. And now, their carefully constructed reality stands on unstable ground. Not because you tore it apart with force, but because the very connection they feared most is still alive, breathing, and refusing to be forgotten. Some battles in the unseen aren't fought with equal weapons. They're fought with inverted forces that turn the original strike back on the sender. The one tasked with engineering your downfall began encountering outcomes that defied the very logic they trusted. Every layer of their own shielding seemed to split apart, as if the energy they unleashed had been altered mid-flight and returned in a form they couldn't withstand. Their instruments, once seen as extensions of their will, now reacted as though your presence had quietly rewritten their instructions. Their frustration deepened as each carefully constructed barrier dissolved under its own weight. The currents they tried to bend toward harm began circling, reshaping, and landing with precision on their own doorstep. The more they pushed, the more the rebound intensified, like a rhythm they could no longer control. They had entered a contest with a protection far older and more intricate than anything their training could explain. Across the network of those who joined in the interference, a strange pattern emerged. One by one, they began stumbling into the same forms of hardship they had once engineered for you. The tongue that spread falsehoods found itself ensnared in the same rumor web it once spun. The hands that worked to sever bonds were now watching their own ties dissolve in silence. The eyes that once judged you with suspicion now turned inward, finding their own reflection unbearable. Even those who operated from the shadows began to feel their fortunes shift. A quiet isolation set in among them, once powerful voices now unheard, once secure positions quietly undermined. Each ripple mirrored the exact wounds they had tried to carve into your path, as if every act had been logged and assigned its counterpart. Amidst this unraveling, the one at the center of it all began to experience an uninvited flood of remembrance. Conversations once buried rose to the surface in vivid detail, carrying emotions that could no longer be numbed. Advice they had brushed aside now rang with undeniable accuracy. Every scene returned sharper than before, each revealing that your perspective had been aligned with truths they had resisted. The awakening did not arrive with fanfare. It crept in through the smallest cracks in their defenses. But once inside, it grew quickly, drawing connections between the warnings you had offered and the betrayals they had refused to see. Those around them noticed the change too. Moments of hesitation in conversations, pauses where once there had been certainty. The cracks widened when they spoke of you in moments of unguarded honesty. These weren't confessions to allies, but slips in rooms where your name had been forbidden. Each mention was like a flare in the night, alerting those who had worked hardest to bury you that their influence was no longer absolute. Panic set in. They recognized that the mental conditioning they had invested so much in was failing. The long hours of psychological shaping, the orchestrated campaigns, the layers of external interference. All of it was starting to crumble under the weight of something they could not contain. Instead of reassessing, they misread the shift as a call to escalate. The escalation was reckless. The one they hired doubled their efforts, claiming that with the right sequence of actions they could close the door between you forever. They sold the idea that not only could they remove you from the present, but they could also seal off every future path that might lead to love, connection, or fulfillment. These promises came with elaborate instructions and amplified intent, but the flaw was already in motion. They were attempting to overwrite a script that was not theirs to edit. The more they tried to bind, the more the bonds snapped under unseen pressure. The force they hoped would contain you only expanded your reach. Each aggressive attempt seemed to erode their own stability. Nights grew restless, not from outside threats, but from visions they could not shake, images of futures where their plans had dissolved and you stood untouched. The stronger they pushed, the more those visions burned into them. It was in this spiral that their greatest error revealed itself. They underestimated the intelligence of the forces that guarded you. Every move they made was not just countered. It was studied, mirrored, and returned in a way that ensured they learned the lesson firsthand. This was no chaotic backlash. It was a measured unfolding, an intricate rebalancing of everything they had attempted to twist. In trying to rewrite your trajectory, they had unknowingly carved the path to their own unraveling. By the time they recognized the inevitability of the turn, the process had moved beyond their reach. The very network they had assembled to keep you contained was now dispersing, each member too consumed with their own troubles to maintain the original cause. And so, the campaign that began as a united front ended in scattered fragments, not because you fought them on their terms, but because you stood firmly in the alignment they could never replicate, a foundation that turned every strike into an echo, and every echo into their own undoing. Some paths are guarded by forces that cannot be persuaded, bribed, or tricked. They move only when a sacred order is disturbed. The instant they pushed their campaign against you into territory they didn't understand, they triggered a chain of events that even their most seasoned advisors couldn't have predicted. What they thought was control became the very signal that summoned intervention from levels they didn't believe were real. The first disruption appeared quietly. The one they had been influencing began to feel their grip weaken. The steady stream of manipulation that had shaped their thoughts started leaking away, leaving them exposed to clarity they hadn't felt in months. The withdrawal from that toxic current was brutal, not just emotional, but physical, as if the body itself was purging what didn't belong. Around the same time, those who had been the architects of this web began feeling its weight collapse inward. Their health faltered without reason. Their emotions mirrored the very turmoil they had tried to place in your life. Every discomfort they had wished upon you took a seat in their own world, each as precise as if tailored to them alone. The orchestrator's closest allies fared no better. Their careers wobbled without warning. Their friendships unraveled in the same ways they had worked to unravel yours. The one who had once spoken the loudest against you now found themselves on the receiving end of whispers they couldn't trace or silence. Then came the misstep that would dissolve their secrecy entirely. The one in the middle, freed just enough to question, sought help outside the confines of their circle. They didn't stumble into another charlatan. They found a practitioner whose integrity was evident before a single word was spoken. This healer didn't need hours of explanation. They could read the fractures in the energy field instantly. They traced the threads of interference, identified the foreign constructs that had been planted, and pointed out the exact points of emotional conditioning designed to keep them tethered. Their insight didn't stop there. They were connected to others, individuals who had been quietly documenting the work of those responsible for such sabotage. This wasn't a single skirmish. It was part of a repeating pattern, a deliberate effort aimed at cutting down those whose growth could shift the balance of power in unseen realms. Proof began stacking up faster than they could hide it. Messages outlining the plans, financial transfers disguised as harmless transactions, testimony from others whose lives had been carved into by the same hands. It was no longer a personal attack. It was evidence of an organized effort that had touched more lives than anyone realized. With the false structures removed, clarity returned in waves. Suppressed recollections poured in with detail too sharp to dismiss. The emotions that came with them were raw, undeniable, and impossible to bury again. The sense of connection that had been smothered rose back to the surface, stronger than before. Meanwhile, you had been untouched in the way they feared most, not only enduring, but advancing. The isolation they aimed for had been replaced by connections that could not be engineered or dissolved by outside influence. The limitations they imagined for you had been replaced with doors they could never find, much less close. Their realization was bitter. They had spent their resources and focus trying to dismantle someone who was never actually within their reach. While they plotted your absence, you were expanding your presence into places they couldn't follow. The irony was undeniable. Their attacks had served as fuel. Every strike they sent became material for your growth. Every obstacle, reworked into a foundation stone. Every attempt to dim your light only honed it until it cut through the very shadows they hid behind. What they thought was a campaign of destruction became, in truth, a collaboration in your evolution. One they never consented to, and one they could never undo. Some reckonings are so complete that they dismantle not just the illusion, but the very identity built around it. The figure who once claimed dominion over another's choices came face to face with a truth they had buried beneath layers of justification. They had never been the rightful keeper of that bond. What they called devotion was nothing more than possession wearing the mask of care. What they thought was guidance was revealed as control designed to feed their own emptiness. And the one they trusted to help them maintain that control found themselves consumed by the very current they had been directing toward others, learning too late that the forces they summoned had no loyalty. The one in the middle, now stripped of the haze that once shaped their decisions, found themselves grieving in a way that words could barely hold. It wasn't the loss of another that weighed heavy. It was the loss of the version of themselves that could have chosen truth but didn't. They mourned the self that had traded genuine connection for obedience, light for comfort, integrity for compliance. Yet beneath all the distortion and interference, something you had left with them endured. In the earliest days, your presence had planted quiet signals, small awakenings disguised as moments of kindness, simple acts that carried a depth they couldn't measure at the time. Those seeds had been buried under manipulation, but never extinguished. Now, with the false scaffolding removed, they began to grow. The lessons you gave became their compass. The insight you offered became the filter through which they now examined every past choice. And the way you loved without bargaining became the standard they held up to every relationship, finding that most couldn't match it. The light you had shared refused to dim, even when they were convinced it was gone. It became clear that what you had given them was never truly about them. It was a living demonstration. You had shown what care could look like when it was free of transaction. You had proven that love can operate without the fear of losing it. And you had embodied the truth that authentic connection plants roots deep enough to survive even in hostile ground. When the turbulence finally settled, it was not the story of someone who had simply survived. It was the account of a strategy so perfectly aligned with higher order that every twist had been accounted for. The kindness was the opening act. The betrayal was the rising conflict. The exposure was the turning point. And the transformation was the ending that had always been written. Every individual involved had been a participant in something much larger than they could grasp. Even those who had worked hardest against you were unknowingly contributing to the refining of your spirit. The one you had once poured into now understood that your worth was never in what you offered, but in what remained when you stood without giving at all. The would-be gatekeeper learned that trying to obstruct what is destined only serves to hasten its arrival. The manipulator who believed themselves untouchable discovered that some currents in this universe cannot be bent toward harm. And you emerged from the center of it all, unchanged in essence, but stronger in every dimension that mattered. What they had tried to erase was the very quality that made you impossible to replace. The care they attempted to eliminate was the care that would always find its way to those prepared to hold it. The resilience they sought to weaken became the signature of your presence, something no imitation could replicate. Your existence was never just about one connection. While they were busy fixating on keeping you from one person, they failed to see the scope of your reach. Your energy was never singular. It resonated with countless others whose own journeys mirrored your own. And in the irony they could never admit, their efforts to isolate you only amplified your visibility to those who were ready to awaken. The very resistance they mounted became the spark for a wider ignition, connecting threads they never intended to touch. In the end, the entire sequence was never about their control or your survival. It was about your expansion. They were chapters in a book that had been written long before their names were even considered, and their attempts to redirect it only deepened the inevitability of its conclusion. The energy you once directed toward that connection did not vanish when they believed they had cut it off. It multiplied, shifted, and began weaving itself into outcomes they could never anticipate or obstruct. Every act of kindness you extended, every insight you offered, every moment you used to lift another became currents moving outward, shaping alignments and possibilities they could not even perceive. What they assumed was victory was, in reality, the opening of countless unseen doors. The force of their interference became raw material in your hands. What they sent to fracture you was absorbed, refined, and reshaped into a deeper source of momentum. Instead of becoming weighed down by the heaviness of their intent, you transformed it into a fuel that expanded your influence far beyond its original scope. Now, the environment itself seems to respond differently to your presence. The structure of opportunities is shifting in ways that position you exactly where you need to be. Paths clear without warning, resources align without being requested, and encounters unfold as though following an intricate map drawn by something far greater than any human hand. The one who was turned against you is beginning to feel a grief that moves past personal loss. It is the ache of a life unlived. They have glimpses of a version of themselves that would have walked beside you, and they can feel the depth of that choice echoing through every part of their being. It is not nostalgia. It is recognition of a destiny that they stepped away from. Those who sought to weaken you are struggling to make sense of how you not only endured but evolved into something they didn't believe possible. Their understanding of power was limited to control, force, and influence, none of which explain why you are flourishing while they are unraveling. Your resilience contradicts every assumption they made about how this was supposed to end. Even the most skeptical observers can see that your life is now marked by an ease that doesn't fit into any logical model they know. Circumstances bend toward your favor with a timing too precise to dismiss as coincidence. Allies appear ready to stand with you before you even need to ask. Support flows in through routes untouched by the blocks they once thought were airtight. The most confounding truth for them is that your vitality has amplified rather than diminished. They believed their tactics would strip you down to your lowest point, yet you stand brighter, steadier, and more aligned than before. Their strikes didn't extinguish your presence, they concentrated it.